So we are going to start today by asking you to, well, to visualize a very specific, like hyper-localized event.
Right, a very distinct mental picture.
Yeah, exactly. I want you to picture the sky over Helsinki on April 9th, 2026. It is early spring, which, if you know Finland, that means the air still has that biting, heavy northern chill, the kind that just cuts right through your coat.
Oh yeah, it is not a warm spring day.
Not at all.
Yeah?
So you're standing outside the Finnish Parliament building, and the architecture there is, it's imposing, massive, monolithic, designed to project this sense of permanence and just untouchable authority.
Like a fortress of bureaucracy, basically.
Exactly. And parked right in the shadow of that bureaucratic monolith, bathed in the smell of diesel exhaust and damp asphalt, is this tiny, tiny fleet of tractors.
There's this tiny group.
Right. We are talking about maybe a dozen heavy agricultural machines, a couple of transport trucks, and fewer than 100 people.
It creates this really stark visual dissonance. You know, you have the polished granite and glass of the Legislative Center, which is built to house all this abstract political maneuvering.
Right.
And it contrasts violently with these muddy utilitarian machines.
Yeah.
Machines that are quite literally designed to claw calories out of frozen soil.
Yeah. The physical scale of the protest is incredibly small. It entirely lacks the massive crowds, the chanting, the chaotic energy we usually associate with a societal breaking point.
It is quiet, very contained.
And yet that highly contained, almost melancholic gathering is the ignition point for our deep dive today.
It really is.
We are exploring an essay triggered by this exact event. The piece is titled The Boiling Frog of Neoliberal Agriculture. And our mission today is to decode this text, to kind of trace the intellectual architecture the author builds, to connect a dozen idling tractors in Helsinki to the most sweeping systemic global vulnerabilities we face today.
It is a massive leap, but he makes it work.
He really does. We're going to unpack the mechanics of global food security, the lethal frictions of extreme economic theory when you apply it to physical geography, and the mathematical modeling of societal collapse.
And remarkably, we also get into how this author weaves in the implications of artificial superintelligence and extraterrestrial salvation theories.
I know it sounds crazy, but it all connects. It's a dense, deeply layered manifesto. But before we start dissecting the arguments, we really need to establish a clear framework for you, the listener.
Yes, this is crucial.
The source text operates as a highly charged, relentless critique of modern political and economic paradigms. I mean, the author is aggressively dismantling the foundational assumptions of globalized right-wing market economics.
While simultaneously, displaying total contempt for the current iterations of both left-wing and right-wing political establishments, he takes no prisoners.
He really doesn't. So we are stating this unequivocally right at the top. Our function here is analytical, not editorial.
We are just guides.
Exactly. We are acting as impartial guides through the architecture of this author's worldview. We are not validating his political critiques, and we aren't dismissing them either.
Right. Our objective is just to ensure you fully comprehend the mechanics of his argument.
Yeah, the historical and philosophical load-bearing walls he uses to support his thesis, and the logical conclusions he draws, regardless of your personal alignment with his worldview.
And that architecture, it really begins with the title's core metaphor. The author operates on the premise that modern globalized society is the proverbial frog in the heating pot.
The boiling frog.
Exactly. The gradual implementation of what he terms neoliberal economic policies represents the incremental rise in water temperature.
Okay.
And his core thesis is that the agricultural sector, the people physically tethered to the land, they are simply the peripheral nervous system of the frog.
Oh, that's an intense way to put it.
Right. They are the first to register that the water has reached a lethal temperature, while the brain, meaning the urban political center, just remains comfortably numb to the impending boil.
Wow. And the text anchors this macro-level theory in the physical reality of that April tractor march. The author's tone here is, well, it's caustic.
Very sarcastic.
He refuses to treat the Parliament building with any institutional reverence at all. He explicitly labels it Finland's biggest circus tent.
The circus tent.
And he details how a handful of politicians emerged from the tent to interface with the farmers. The farmers articulated their existential financial distress, and the politicians just offered verbal assurances that their respective parties were committed to addressing the sector's challenges.
But the author views that exchange not as a failure of communication, but as a scripted performance.
Just totally hollow.
Exactly. He argues that the politicians offering those assurances are entirely impotent. I mean, in his structural model of the world, domestic politicians are essentially regional public relations managers.
That's all they are to him.
Right. They are structurally detached from the biological and economic realities of agricultural production. He posits that they do not possess the agency to alter the trajectory of the farming sector because they are subordinate to a higher operational mandate.
They are just taking orders from above.
Yes, they are executing directives derived from the structural imperatives of the globalized market and international trade frameworks.
Which brings us to the statistical reality driving those tractors to the capital in the first place. Because the text outlines a mechanical failure within the Finnish agricultural engine.
The numbers are grim.
Really grim. The data points aren't just reflecting diminished quarterly profits. They indicate systemic collapse. The author points out that Finnish farms are ceasing operations at a rate of 2 per day.
2 a day.
Every single day, 2 independent agricultural nodes go offline permanently.
And then you add the demographic data he provides. The average age of a farm operator in Finland is approaching 60 years old.
60.
Yeah, so you are looking at an industry experiencing simultaneous financial liquidation and generational attrition.
I mean, we can look at this through a structural engineering lens. It is akin to standing in the basement of a skyscraper and watching the primary load-bearing concrete pillars actively spall and crumble into dust.
Right.
But the management committee, sitting up in the penthouse, the circus tent, they are entirely consumed by a heated debate over optimizing the building's HVAC efficiency or rebranding the lobby.
They're completely missing the actual crisis.
They are treating a fundamental structural failure as a minor aesthetic inconvenience. I mean, if the literal generation of human caloric intake is the absolute baseline requirement for a functioning state, why is the infrastructure producing it collapsing with barely a whisper of broader societal panic?
Well, the author identifies a highly specific mechanism driving this quiet eradication.
Yeah.
And he doesn't blame localized mismanagement or, unfortunate weather
I don't know,
patterns.
he goes much bigger.
He does. He points directly to the friction generated when their rigid algorithms of global market economics are forced upon the unyielding realities of subarctic geography. The collapse is quiet because it is not an accident. It is the system operating exactly as its underlying code dictates.
So if the farms are dying and the politicians are ignoring it, we have to look past the local legislation and examine the overarching economic operating system. The text relentlessly attacks the application of the global free market.
Specifically, the doctrine of comparative advantage.
Yes, applying that to domestic food production. Because the fundamental logic of that market dictates that capital and production will aggressively seek the path of least resistance and maximum efficiency.
Right, and if you look at the mechanics of comparative advantage, it makes perfect mathematical sense in a frictionless vacuum.
Here on a spreadsheet.
Exactly. If a massive conglomerate in a temperate equatorial climate can leverage year-round growing seasons, cheap labor pools, and immense economies of scale to produce a metric ton of grain for a fraction of the cost it takes out, a Finnish farmer battling permafrost, and a microscopic growing window.
The algorithm knows exactly who wins that fight.
The market algorithm dictates a clear outcome. The algorithm says the Finnish operation is an inefficient allocation of resources. It dictates that Finland should cease agricultural production and simply import the cheaper grain.
But the author drags that frictionless theory out into the freezing mud of the real world. He points out the profound geographical arrogance of applying that algorithm universally. I mean, Finland is not a spreadsheet.
No, it's a very harsh reality.
The climate is hostile. The soil requires intense, highly specialized, localized knowledge to yield anything. When you subject a Finnish farmer to direct, unprotected price competition with a mega farm in South America, the outcome isn't innovation.
No, the outcome is systemic bankruptcy.
Exactly. The invisible hand isn't acting as an impartial market referee here. It is acting as an executioner for any operation burdened by geographic reality.
And the critical distinction the author makes is that he refuses to categorize food as a standard consumer commodity. He argues that subjecting wheat or dairy to the exact same ruthless optimization algorithms as consumer electronics or fast fashion is a fatal categorical error.
You can't eat an iPhone.
Right. He defines food production as a fate of society metric.
It is the ultimate baseline of national sovereignty. If a nation voluntarily dismantles its internal capacity to feed its population simply because importing calories is currently cheaper on the global spot market, that nation has entirely surrendered its autonomy.
It becomes a hostage.
A total hostage. It is tethered to the complex, highly fragile logistical webs of international shipping, foreign labor markets, and the diplomatic whims of the nations actually controlling the soil.
The text frames reliance on the European Union's integrated market rules not as economic progress, but as a deliberate dismantling of Finland's national supply security.
Yeah, and the author uses recent historical shocks to demonstrate the fragility of that dependency. He points to the geopolitical instability generated by the previous U.S. presidential administration, specifically referencing Donald Trump's transactional approach to international alliances.
And he immediately pairs that with the systemic shockwave
Yeah.
of Vladimir Putin's military aggression in Eastern Europe.
Those events acted as massive stress tests on the globalized system. I mean, we saw borders snap shut, global shipping lanes choke, and agricultural inputs like fertilizer just skyrocket in cost overnight.
Suddenly, the assumption that the global market would always efficiently deliver cheap calories was shattered.
And the author notes that this structural, terrifying vulnerability briefly penetrated the political consciousness. The politicians in the circus tent had a fleeting moment of clarity where they realized that relying on just-in-time global logistics for tomorrow's dinner is an incredibly dangerous game.
However, his analysis is that this cognitive realization resulted in absolutely zero mechanical change to the system.
Nothing changed.
Nothing. The fear was temporary. The underlying economic architecture remained untouched. The structural dismantling of domestic agriculture continued unabated, despite the glaring proof that the global supply chain was vulnerable to catastrophic failure.
Which leads the author to this sweeping condemnation of the entire modern political apparatus. He argues that the traditional spectrum of left-wing versus right-wing politics has been entirely neutralized.
It's all the same to him.
Yeah, when people lament the rise of socialism or the lack of progressive alternatives, the author counters that they are misdiagnosing the disease. He posits that there is currently only one functional ideology governing the state, and that is an entrenched, immovable framework of right-wing neoliberalism.
And he finds a dark irony in how the system attempts to self-correct. When the alternative political factions rise up, claiming they will fix the localized devastation caused by market integration, their proposed legislative solutions inevitably involve injecting more market forces into the equation.
Right, it's always more of the same medicine.
Exactly. They propose cutting regulations to increase competitiveness, or offering tax incentives to spur corporate agricultural investment. They're attempting to solve the localized destruction caused by hypercompetition by prescribing a heavier dose of hypercompetition.
The author maintains that national supply security is structurally incompatible with a system demanding endless quarterly optimization.
It just doesn't work.
But let me interject a counter perspective here, because the defense of the market system is usually rooted in consumer benefit, right?
Sure.
The standard counter-argument is that market competition forces adaptation. It drives down the price of groceries at the checkout counter. It forces inefficient operators to innovate or exit, which theoretically benefits the entire population by lowering the cost of living. So why does he entirely dismiss the utility of market efficiency?
He dismisses it because efficiency in a stable environment becomes a lethal vulnerability in a chaotic one.
Oh, that makes sense.
The market optimizes for the present microsecond of stability. It ruthlessly strips away any redundancy or surplus capacity because redundancy costs money.
I think we can map this onto a modern technological equivalent. Relying on an optimized global free market for a nation's foundational food security is mechanically identical to relying on a surge-priced rideshare algorithm to run a city's ambulance fleet.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
Right. During a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the algorithm is flawless. It deploys cars efficiently, the cost is low, the system is completely frictionless. But the moment a systemic shock occurs, like a massive natural disaster or a coordinated attack, everyone in the city requires emergency transport simultaneously.
And the algorithm breaks.
The algorithm responds to that spike in demand the only way it knows how. It skyrockets the price to $10,000 a ride, or the network simply collapses under the localized strain, leaving no vehicles available at any price.
Wow, yeah.
Optimization and efficiency are fantastic luxuries, right up until the exact microsecond you face a localized existential crisis, at which point the lack of physical, dedicated redundancy leaves you bleeding out on the pavement.
That is a highly accurate mapping of the author's dread. He looks at the global food market as that algorithm. If a cascading geopolitical crisis occurs, the nations that actually control the soil and possess the physical infrastructure will immediately halt exports to secure their own populations.
They'll feed their own first.
Exactly. And Finland, having allowed its internal agricultural infrastructure to be liquidated in the name of algorithmic efficiency, will find itself facing a massive caloric deficit with no physical mechanism to generate food, regardless of how much capital they throw at the problem.
And to build the intellectual framework for this impending crisis, the author executes this fascinating pivot. He doesn't just rely on crop yields and market observations. He introduces a highly sophisticated academic reading list.
It's quite the list.
It is. We are looking at a retired farmer and embedded systems programmer who utilizes complex sociological, economic, and philosophical theory to dissect the mechanics of a failing farm.
He leverages these theorists to explain the behavioral and structural drivers of the collapse. And he begins by utilizing the work of Alfie Kohn to dismantle the psychological assumptions of competition.
So Cohn's work is largely focused on behavioral psychology, right? Specifically, the destructive nature of extrinsic rewards and forced competition. How does the author mechanically apply Kohn to the business of growing barley in Finland?
He applies it to the erosion of the social fabric that historically allowed agriculture in harsh environments to function. Historically, farming in marginal climates required intensive mutual aid.
People had to work together.
Right, it was a localized network of cooperative survival. If a tractor broke during a crucial harvest window or a barn needed raising, the community operated as a unified resource pool.
You couldn't survive alone.
Kohn argues that introducing forced competition doesn't just increase productivity, it actively rewires the psychology of the participants. It shifts the operational paradigm from how do we survive this winter together to a zero-sum game where my financial survival requires your bankruptcy.
Wow.
The author is using Kohn to map out how the imposition of global market metrics systematically dismantled the cooperative networks of rural Finland, isolating individual farmers and turning them into atomized, highly stressed economic units fighting a losing battle against global megacorporations.
So the system physically isolates them, but the author goes further to explain how the system also morally degrades them in the eyes of the ruling class. Which brings us to his incorporation of Harvard philosopher Michael Sandel.
This is a really crucial point.
Sandel has written extensively about what he calls meritocratic hubris. I want to dig into the mechanics of that hubris, because it isn't just a vague sense of snobbery, is it?
Not at all. Sandel argues that the architecture of a meritocracy fundamentally alters how a society assigns moral value to success and failure. If a society operates on the stated belief that the system is a pure meritocracy, where intelligence and hard work are the sole determinants of economic outcome, then it necessarily follows that the people who reach the top of the hierarchy believe their wealth and power are entirely deserved.
They think they earned every penny purely through virtue.
Exactly. They view their success as empirical proof of their superior intellect and moral virtue.
And the lethal corollary to that is how they view the people at the bottom. If success is a virtue you earned, then failure is a moral failing you brought upon yourself.
Precisely the mechanic the author is highlighting. He uses Sandel to explain the psychological disconnect of the politicians in the circus tent. The political and corporate managers who have successfully navigated the abstract rules of the globalized knowledge economy look at the Finnish farmer struggling to avoid bankruptcy.
And what do they see?
Through the lens of meritocratic hubris, the politician doesn't see a victim of geographic disadvantage or a vital component of national security. The politician sees an uneducated, stubborn, inefficient worker who simply failed to adapt to the modern global market.
That is so bleak.
The author is mapping Sandel's philosophy to explain the total evaporation of empathy within the political class. The elites genuinely believe the farmers deserve to go bankrupt because they failed the meritocratic test.
That is a brutal psychological mechanism. But the author doesn't stop at analyzing the psychology of the game. He brings in political scientist Michael Parenti to argue that the game itself is fundamentally fraudulent.
Right, Parenti is all about the architecture of power.
So if the politicians believe they're winning a fair meritocracy, how does Parenti's framework dismantle that?
Parenti introduces the concept of institutional capture and deliberate structural rigging. He argues that the economic systems we treat as natural phenomena, like the invisible hand of the market, are actually highly engineered constructs.
Well, they aren't forces of nature.
It's exactly. They're legal and financial architectures, drafted, lobbied for, and implemented by entrenched corporate and political powers, specifically designed to consolidate their own dominance.
We are talking about the granular mechanics of international trade, the subsidy structures that reward massive scale while ignoring localized ecological damage, the patent laws around genetically modified seeds that trap farmers in proprietary ecosystems.
Right, all the red tape that actually benefits the big guys.
The author is using Parenti to argue that the Finnish farmer isn't losing a fair fight against the South American megafarm. They are losing a fight where the megafarm literally wrote the rules of the referee's handbook.
The game was rigged from the start.
The global market isn't an impartial force of nature. It is a weaponized legal structure designed to extract wealth from the localized producer and funnel it upward to the transnational manager.
And that upward funneling of wealth accelerates violently during moments of systemic stress, which is where the author brings in Naomi Klein. He specifically utilizes her theory of the shock doctrine, or disaster capitalism.
Right. Klein's premise is that when a society suffers a massive trauma, like a natural disaster, a sudden war, an engineered economic collapse, the population is entirely consumed by the immediate mechanics of survival.
They are disoriented and desperate.
And in that window of chaos, the corporate and political elite push through radical, highly unpopular economic policies that consolidate their power, policies that would trigger riots if they were proposed during a period of stability. So how is the author observing disaster capitalism functioning on the Finnish farm?
He observes it in the mechanics of land consolidation. When those 2 farms per day are forced into bankruptcy by the engineered frictions of the market, the physical asset, meaning the soil and the infrastructure, it does not evaporate.
It has to go somewhere.
It undergoes a forced liquidation. The local family is evicted, and the asset is typically absorbed at a severe discount by a massive, highly capitalized agribusiness or a corporate holding company. The author views the chronic, grinding distress of the agricultural sector not as a failure of the system, but as a deliberate mechanism to facilitate the transfer of physical land sovereignty from the local population to concentrated corporate entities. The ongoing crisis of the small farmer is the required fuel for the expansion of the agricultural monopoly.
So we have a framework where community is destroyed by forced competition. The victims are morally blamed for their own destruction by an arrogant elite. The rules are engineered to guarantee that destruction, and the resulting distress is actively exploited to strip the victims of their physical assets.
It is a bleak, interlocking machine of societal extraction.
Extremely bleak. But what happens when the machine extracts too much? Because this is where he introduces the mathematical modeling of Peter Turchin.
Yes, Turchin's work is vital here because he attempts to quantify historical cycles of collapse. He coined the term elite overproduction.
Elite overproduction.
Yes. The mechanism works like this. As a society generates massive wealth through these extractive systems, it expands its higher education and professional credentialing networks. It begins producing massive cohorts of highly educated, ambitious individuals who all expect to occupy the top tier of the socioeconomic pyramid.
They all expect to have a corner office in the penthouse or a seat inside the circus tent.
Right.
But the physical structure of the pyramid hasn't changed. There is a finite, hard-capped limit to the number of available elite positions. There are only so many parliamentary seats, only so many corporate board positions, only so many high-status media roles.
And the math becomes unsustainable. You have thousands of highly credentialed individuals fighting for hundreds of positions. This triggers fierce intra-elite competition.
They start fighting each other.
Exactly. And to fund this escalating status war, the elites must extract ever-increasing amounts of resources from the foundational base of the society. The working class, the physical infrastructure, the agricultural sector. They squeeze the foundation tighter and tighter to fund their battles in the penthouse.
And the author maps this directly onto the political disconnect we discussed earlier. The politicians aren't ignoring the farmers just out of malice. They are ignoring them because the politicians are entirely consumed in a desperate, zero-sum knife fight with other elites for social and political dominance.
Maintaining a functioning localized food supply doesn't generate the necessary political capital or financial kickbacks required to win the elite status war.
Right, so the foundation rots while the elites fight over the steering wheel of a vehicle that is rapidly running out of fuel.
Which culminates in his final philosophical load-bearing wall, John Rawls, and his veil of ignorance. This is where the author shifts from diagnosing the mechanics of the collapse to offering a profound ethical indictment of the architects.
Let's break down the mechanics of the Rawlsian thought experiment because it is one of the most powerful tools in modern political philosophy.
It really is.
Rawls argued that human beings are inherently biased by their own current socioeconomic position.
Right.
Like, a billionaire thinks low taxes are just. A starving person thinks wealth redistribution is just. So, Rawls proposed a mechanism for designing a truly fair society. You must design the legal and economic architecture from behind a veil of ignorance.
Meaning you don't know who you will be in that society.
Exactly. You get to write all the rules, but you do so with zero knowledge of where you will be placed in that society once the simulation begins. You don't know your race, your gender, your physical health, your IQ, or your inherited wealth.
And the logic is that self-preservation will force you to design a system that aggressively protects the most vulnerable because you are terrified of the mathematical probability that you might spawn into the simulation as one of them.
You would never design a hyper-competitive winner-take-all arena because the penalty for losing is total devastation, and you cannot guarantee you will be born a winner.
The author wields this concept like a hammer against the circus tent. He is arguing that if the politicians and corporate managers had to design a national food system behind the veil of ignorance,
If they actually had to risk it themselves.
right, if they had to write the agricultural policy, knowing there was a high probability they would wake up the next morning as a Finnish farmer facing bankruptcy, or a low-income urban citizen facing an empty supermarket shelf during a border closure, they would instantly abandon the neoliberal algorithm.
Without hesitation.
They would immediately recognize that applying cutthroat global efficiency metrics to the baseline requirement for biological survival is institutional insanity. They would build a system prioritized entirely on localized redundancy, resilience, and security.
Taking all these theorists together, the author constructs a massive, interlocking critique. He uses high-level academic theory to explain the exact mechanical trajectory of the tractor parked outside Parliament. But he drives toward a deeply visceral, inevitable conclusion.
He notes that the elites, isolated in their meritocratic hubris and consumed by their intra-elite warfare, are fundamentally miscalculating the nature of physical reality.
They think they're above it.
They believe their advanced degrees, their algorithmic wealth, and their political influence elevate them above the physical constraints of the world. But the author issues a brutal reality check. When the complex logistical webs snap and the grocery distribution centers empty out, the abstraction of wealth becomes meaningless.
You cannot consume a diversified stock portfolio. You cannot digest a PhD in political science.
You really can't.
That stark physical reality is what forces us to examine the impending climax of this entire structure. Because the author has diagnosed the disease, detailed the rotting foundation, and exposed the psychological delusions of the management class. But he acknowledges a glaring behavioral reality. The streets of Helsinki are not filled with rioters.
No, there are only a dozen tractors.
Right. If the underlying math of the society is pointing toward catastrophic failure, why is the general population so overwhelmingly docile?
This is where we return to the biology of the boiling frog. The author argues that the collapse hasn't triggered mass revolt because the neurological triggers for panic haven't been tripped.
It's too slow?
The degradation of the system is incremental, and it is heavily masked by the anesthetic of modern digitized convenience.
The frog is still boiling because the water, while getting dangerously hot, still feels relatively comfortable. We have an illusion of infinite abundance. The Wi-Fi signal is strong, the streaming algorithms provide endless dopamine loops, and despite the systemic fragility, complex logistics still manage to deliver ultra-processed, low-nutrient calories to the local drive-thru at an accessible price point.
The immediate localized discomfort of dismantling the system vastly outweighs the perceived danger of remaining in the pot.
But the author is focused on the mathematics of the trajectory. The temperature is rising, and he reserves his most evocative, dystopian forecasting for the demographic he believes is most structurally vulnerable when the water finally reaches a rolling boil, and that is the urban population.
He paints a horrifying picture of the concrete jungle. We need to analyze the mechanics of urban vulnerability. The author views the modern city dweller as an entity that has entirely outsourced its biological survival to the invisible ant.
Totally dependent.
They exist in a highly specialized, hyper-fragile terrarium. They do not possess the localized knowledge to cultivate calories. They do not have access to physical soil. They do not understand the mechanical systems that purify their water or generate their electricity.
Their entire survival strategy consists of swiping a piece of plastic against a glass screen and trusting that a global supply chain will magically materialize a wrapped package of protein.
And when that global supply chain finally fractures, whether through the escalating pressures of climate volatility, a cascading geopolitical conflict, or the collapse of the hyper-leveraged financial systems funding the logistics, the urban centers will become localized traps.
It's terrifying. When the trucks stop running, the supermarkets empty in a matter of hours. The city dwellers are suddenly confronted with the terrifying reality that their digital wealth has zero physical conversion value in a calorie-negative environment.
And the author captures this impending urban shock with a phrase that perfectly encapsulates his pitch-black humor and his economic critique. He prophesies that the urban masses will be left staring at empty shelves, forced to survive on neoliberal cabbage soup, where the upper lip is the only meat on the spoon.
Oh, man.
It is a stunning piece of imagery.
Neoliberal cabbage soup.
He uses it to signify an era of brutal, grinding austerity. But crucially, he implies that this austerity is not the result of a genuine, unavoidable Malthusian limit on planetary resources. It is an engineered scarcity resulting directly from the failure of the dominant economic ideology.
And the phrase "the upper lip is the only meat on the spoon." It's a viscerally grotesque metaphor for auto-cannibalism. It suggests a population so entirely stripped of external resources that they are forced to consume their own physical capital to survive.
But the author's cynicism reaches its absolute zenith when he predicts how the political establishment will manage the optics of this systemic collapse.
Oh, this part is brilliant.
He doesn't believe the politicians in the circus tent will step up to a podium and confess that their adherence to globalized market efficiency destroy the national supply chain. Instead, he argues they will execute a massive, cynical rebranding campaign. He predicts the resulting austerity will be packaged and sold to the starving population as the green transition.
This is a highly provocative analytical leap. He is suggesting that the elites will weaponize environmentalism to mask the failure of capitalism.
Exactly.
When the logistical chains fail and the population can no longer afford to consume high-density protein or heat their living spaces, the management class will frame this forced reduction in living standards as a necessary, deeply moral sacrifice required to stabilize the global climate.
The manipulation of the narrative is terrifying. The system extracts all the wealth, centralizes the resources, and leaves the population vulnerable to a systemic shock.
And when the shock hits and you are sitting in a freezing apartment eating cabbage soup, the system tells you, congratulations, you are fulfilling your ethical duty to reduce your carbon footprint. Embrace the poverty. It's saving the planet.
It is the ultimate public relations spin, designed to prevent the population from recognizing that the collapse was engineered by the same people demanding the sacrifice.
And this leads directly into his macro view of historical cycles. Because the author does not necessarily view this impending collapse as an apocalyptic end state for human civilization. He views it through a structural, almost thermodynamic lens.
Human societies build complex, top-heavy structures. The elites extract too much energy from the base, the structure becomes unstable, and a crisis acts as a catalyst to wipe the board clean. The complex systems shatter, and society is reduced back to a localized, low-complexity baseline.
So the bottom players, the survivors who retain some localized physical skills, they are forced back to the absolute starting line. They have to begin the brutal, grueling process of reestablishing agricultural baselines and building rudimentary communities. But what is the trajectory for the elites who engineered the collapse? Surely a systemic reset wipes out their abstract wealth.
According to the author's cyclical model, it does not.
Really?
He argues that the apex players of the system possess the foresight and the concentrated resources to insulate themselves from the kinetic effects of the collapse. They weather the transitional chaos in fortified geographical enclaves, shielded by hard assets and privatized security.
They just hide it out.
They allow the systemic fire to burn itself out, and they simply wait in the ashes. They wait for the survivors, the new generation of bottom players, to expend the blood and sweat required to rebuild the basic infrastructure.
And once the physical systems are operational again,
The elites emerge, leverage their hoarded capital and technological advantages, and immediately begin reestablishing the extractive hierarchies. The actors change, the technology updates, but the fundamental mechanics of the rigged game endlessly repeat.
I have to pause here and inject some serious philosophical pushback. I think any listener engaging with this text is hitting a wall of profound fatalism. We are listening to a retired farmer and programmer methodically prove that our economic systems are predatory, our political systems are impotent, our psychology is manipulated, and even when the system inevitably collapses under its own weight, The predators simply hit the reset button and start exploiting the survivors all over again.
That's a lot to take in.
It is. Does this author offer any structural alternative? Is he outlining a pathway to reform the system, or is he simply sitting in the dark, mapping out the geometry of our doom?
To answer that, we have to navigate through his analysis of the various future trajectories currently being debated in the cultural zeitgeist. He maps out several wildly divergent scenarios, a sort of choose-your-own dystopia matrix.
Choose your own dystopia.
Yeah. He doesn't explicitly endorse any of them as the guaranteed outcome, but he rigorously stress tests the logic of each path.
Let's pull apart the mechanics of these scenarios, because he explores the extreme edges of modern paranoia and technological forecasting. We start with scenario A, which is a structural concept that dominates specific corners of the alternative internet. He labels it the WEF, Great Reset.
The author interprets the World Economic Forum's theoretical frameworks as the blueprint for a highly sterilized, technologically enforced return to medieval feudalism. He anchors this scenario in the infamous conceptual phrase associated with these discussions: "You will own nothing and be happy."
We need to look at the economic architecture of that phrase. It represents the total eradication of private physical property for the working class. It envisions a completely subscription-based reality.
Everything is rented.
Everything. You do not hold the title to your vehicle. You do not possess a deed to your shelter. You do not own the appliances that preserve your food or the devices you use to communicate. You merely lease temporary access to these utilities from a monolithic corporate conglomerate.
And the author notes a chilling paradox in this scenario. He observes that in this hyper-corporate future, the free market and forced competition actually cease to exist.
Wait, really?
Yes, but they aren't replaced by a localized cooperative model. They are replaced by total monopoly. He cites the industrialist David Rockefeller's alleged perspective that competition is a sin when viewed from the absolute top of the hierarchy.
Oh, wow.
The apex rulers of this neo-feudal dystopia eliminate the market because they already own the entire board. There is no competition, only the lords who own the physical infrastructure and the serfs who lease their biological existence on a rolling monthly contract.
But the enforcement mechanism is what makes this scenario uniquely modern and terrifying. In historical feudalism, the lords enforced compliance through kinetic violence, knights with swords, physical barricades. The author points out that the neo-feudal state doesn't require physical violence. It relies entirely on the invisible, omnipresent architecture of smart tech.
Exactly. The compliance is coded directly into the environment. He envisions a reality governed by central bank digital currencies and algorithmic social credit networks.
Just flip a switch.
If a citizen dissents against the mandate of the lords or attempts to organize outside the approved parameters, the system doesn't need to deploy police. The system simply executes a line of code. Your digital wallet is instantly frozen, rendering you incapable of purchasing calories. The smart locks in your leased apartment refuse to open. The autonomous transit network refuses to recognize your biometric ID.
It is a completely frictionless, mathematically perfect system of authoritarian control. It is the ultimate sterile nightmare for an individual whose entire philosophy is rooted in localized autonomy and physical sovereignty. It's a world where you can't even plant a seed without an algorithmic permission slip.
It's the ultimate trap.
So if scenario A is total technological enslavement, what is scenario B?
Scenario B is what the author categorizes as the Great Awakening. This is where he wades into the murky waters of fringe salvation narratives. He examines the desperate psychological coping mechanisms of a population staring down the barrel of scenario A.
People looking for a way out.
He analyzes the theories that an external, vastly superior force will suddenly intervene to dismantle the corrupt hierarchy. He specifically mentions the theories of extraterrestrial intervention, or the sudden emergence of a clandestine network of white hats operating deep within the military-industrial complex who will initiate mass arrests of the global elite.
This is pure deus ex machina. It is the psychological surrender of agency. The underlying logic is that the global architecture of corruption is so deeply entrenched and the technological control grid is so absolute that localized human resistance is mathematically futile.
Right.
Therefore, the only logical hope is that a fleet of alien cruisers drops out of orbit to vaporize the World Economic Forum, or a secret military tribunal simultaneously raids every central bank on the planet.
It is a profound expression of systemic helplessness. But the author's analysis of this scenario is dripping with his trademark structural cynicism.
Yeah.
He doesn't spend time debating the empirical existence of extraterrestrials or secret tribunals.
Hmm.
He focuses purely on the structural aftermath of such an intervention.
And what does he conclude?
He concludes that even if this miraculous salvation occurred, even if the board was magically wiped clean of every corrupt actor overnight, it would ultimately fail to solve the fundamental flaw in the human operating system.
Walk me through his logic there. If you vaporize the architects of the rigged game, doesn't that inherently free the population to build a just society? Why does he reject the clean slate?
Because he views the tendency toward hierarchical extraction as an unavoidable law of human behavioral physics. He argues that the external intervention would merely hit the reset button on the historical cycle we discussed earlier.
So we just start over.
We might experience a brief, golden interlude, a couple of generations of localized peace, decentralized power, and cooperative rebuilding. But eventually, the biological drive for dominance and the efficiencies of centralization would reassert themselves.
The cycle continues.
New ambitious elites would emerge, new alliances would form to consolidate resources, and the architecture of the circus tent would slowly be reconstructed. The alien intervention wouldn't end the game. It would just shuffle the deck and start a new round of the exact same rules.
That is a staggering level of pessimism. He is asserting that human nature is so fundamentally flawed that even literal divine intervention can only provide a temporary pause before we start exploiting each other again.
Yeah, he doesn't hold out much hope for humanity.
Okay, let's look at scenario C. If aliens won't permanently fix it, what about our own creation? Scenario C is the AI singularity.
This is the moment when artificial general intelligence, rapidly accelerating into artificial superintelligence, eclipses human cognitive capacity and assumes managerial control over the complex systems of global logistics, economics, and governance.
Silicon Valley has been attempting to manifest this scenario for decades, pitching it as the ultimate optimization engine that will solve climate change, cure disease, and eliminate resource scarcity. How does the author evaluate the singularity?
He evaluates it as an existential coin toss with zero human agency. He explicitly frames the outcome as a binary probability between two distinct literary and cinematic dystopias.
Which one?
He asks, will the ASI view humanity as a fragile, illogical pet that needs to be carefully managed in a heavily sedated, friction-free terrarium? Essentially Aldous Huxley's Brave New World.
Roar.
Or will the ASI simply execute a cold, mathematical analysis, determine that human biology is the single most inefficient and destructive variable in the planetary ecosystem, and initiate an immediate, systematic eradication protocol? James Cameron's Terminator Judgment Day.
He doesn't view AI as a tool that we will wield. He views it as an alien consciousness that we are recklessly summoning into a complex system we no longer control. We are rolling the dice on the survival of our species, hoping the algorithm calculates that we still have utility. It strips a last remaining illusion of control from the boiling frog.
Which logically forces us into scenario D. And of all the wildly extreme possibilities he maps out, this is the one the author clearly accepts as the most statistically probable. This is the slow boil, the agonizing continuation of the status quo.
The terrifying prospect that the world doesn't end with a dramatic technological reset, an alien invasion, or a sudden nuclear flash. The world simply degrades. What are the day-to-day mechanics of the slow boil?
It is the reality we are currently navigating, subjected to a slow, multi-generational decay function. The political class in the circus tent will continue their performative battles, endlessly promising innovative solutions, while the structural integrity of the foundation silently turns to dust.
The foundation just keeps crumbling.
The vast majority of the population, paralyzed by the complexity of the systems and terrified of losing access to the dwindling comforts of the grid, will remain obediently compliant. They will adapt to the increasingly arbitrary regulations, they will normalize the lowering standards of living, and they will slowly learn to accept the taste of the neoliberal cabbage soup.
The infrastructure will slowly fracture. Power grids will become unreliable. Supply chains will suffer chronic, unpredictable bottlenecks. But the degradation will be just slow enough, just incremental enough that the frog never musters the kinetic energy to jump out of the pot.
It is a future defined not by sudden apocalypse, but by chronic, inescapable fatigue.
But in this scenario, what happens to the outliers? What happens to the individuals who clearly perceive the temperature of the water?
The author predicts a quiet fracturing. A small subset of the population will simply defect from the social contract. They will look at the political circus, look at the fragile global logistics, and say, to hell with this architecture.
Yeah, they just walk away.
They won't attempt a violent revolution because they understand the system is too massive and too heavily armed. Instead, they will quietly drop out. They will retreat to the physical margins of society, attempting to carve out highly localized, independent survival networks, while the monolithic machine of mainstream society continues its slow, grinding descent into dysfunction.
Synthesizing his view on all these scenarios reveals a fascinating architectural feature of the author's mind. He exhibits an absolute, unwavering skepticism toward any external top-down solution. He is fiercely egalitarian in his distrust.
Equal opportunity distrust.
Exactly. He looks at the billionaire class in Davos, attempting to manage the Great Reset. He looks at the theoretical extraterrestrials hovering in orbit, and he looks at the artificial superintelligence gestating in a California server farm, and he assigns them all the exact same threat level. To him, an alien intelligence promising salvation is no different than an EU bureaucrat drafting an agricultural mandate.
They are all external, unaccountable forces attempting to impose a centralized operating system on his localized reality.
That intense rejection of external authority makes you deeply curious about the architecture of the mind producing this analysis. Who exactly is writing this? What specific combination of life experiences and technical training produces a text that seamlessly integrates finished agricultural data, the behavioral psychology of elite overproduction, and the game theory of the AI singularity?
It is time to pull back the curtain on the author. This brings us to the most fascinating psychological puzzle of the entire text: the profile of the man who signs his work simply as Juka. Juka is an intensely complex intellectual character. He initially identifies himself with two highly contrasting labels. He is a retired farmer, and he is a retired embedded systems programmer.
Quite the combo.
He also self-identifies as an anarchist in the original sense.
Let's clarify the mechanical definition of that political label, because the colloquial understanding of an anarchist involves a teenager throwing a brick through a Starbucks window, but he is using it in its strict philosophical context. He defines it as being for life, peace, truth, freedom, and justice.
Right, a very different definition.
He is advocating for a societal architecture built entirely on voluntary cooperation and decentralized localized networks, completely devoid of coercive, top-down state hierarchies. He isn't advocating for chaos, he is advocating for ultimate local responsibility.
It is a philosophy perfectly aligned with his background as an independent farmer. But the truly astonishing, almost surreal element of Juka's profile is the addendum to his essay. He lists an avalanche of professional certifications. It is a volume of study that borders on the obsessive, and we need to look at the timeline. He acquired these certifications between the years 2021 and 2026.
We need to contextualize that exact window of time. That 5-year period encompasses the onset of the global pandemic, the massive, unprecedented deployment of top-down state mandates and behavioral controls, the subsequent supply chain fracturing, and the intense polarization of the global population.
A time of intense stress.
It was a period of maximum systemic stress and maximum societal compliance. Let's look at the specific tools he acquired during that window. What exactly did he study?
The list is heavily skewed toward advanced behavioral psychology and cognitive reprogramming. He lists a practitioner and master practitioner certification in NLP, neurolinguistic programming. He holds a certificate in Gestalt therapy. He is certified in REBT, which stands for Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy.
Keep going.
He achieved a master practitioner level in Ericksonian hypnotherapy. He holds a master's certificate in systems thinking. He is certified as a modern applied psychologist. And he tops it off with an honorary doctorate in philosophy.
Okay, we have to forensically analyze this. We have a man who spent his life physically wrestling with frozen soil to grow calories and writing low-level machine code to control heavy equipment. Why does an agricultural engineer suddenly spend 5 years of a global crisis obsessively studying the mechanics of clinical hypnotherapy and linguistic cognitive programming?
Because he is trying to debug the human operating system.
That's fascinating.
Look at the timeline and his core thesis. Juka is sitting on his farm, watching the macroeconomic data point definitively towards systemic collapse. He sees the supply chains fracturing. He sees the agricultural foundation being intentionally liquidated. And then he looks at the broader population, and he observes them docilely accepting their own destruction.
They're just letting it happen.
They are cheering for the politicians in the circus tent. They are obediently marching into the neo-feudal digital cages. The mathematical logic of his engineering brain cannot comprehend the sheer scale of the cognitive dissonance. He needs to understand why the frog refuses to jump.
So he studies hypnotherapy and NLP because he reaches the terrifying conclusion that the global population is not acting rationally. They are acting as if they are literally under a hypnotic induction. NLP, at its core, is the study of how language and neurological pathways can be manipulated to alter human behavior.
Right.
He isn't studying this to open a therapy clinic. He is studying it to reverse engineer the propaganda. He wants to map out the exact linguistic formulas and media algorithms the political and corporate elites are using to pacify the masses. He is trying to decode the matrix of mass compliance.
And that psychological deep dive is perfectly complemented by his certification in systems thinking. This is where his background as an embedded systems programmer becomes crucial. An embedded systems engineer writes the code that operates directly on the physical hardware, like the microprocessors controlling the fuel injection on a tractor.
Right.
They are trained to view the machine as an integrated whole, where a microscopic failure in a single sensor can trigger a catastrophic cascade that shuts down the entire engine.
He is simply taking that exact diagnostic framework and scaling it up to the level of global civilization. He isn't looking at the Finnish agricultural crisis as an isolated political issue. He is viewing the dying farm as a failing sensor in the global engine. He maps the flow of capital, the brittle logistics of just-in-time shipping, and the psychological algorithms of the population, and his systems analysis tells him the engine is redlining and the catastrophic cascade has already begun.
It is a uniquely potent intellectual synthesis. His engineering background allows him to dispassionately map out the macro vulnerabilities of the global architecture, the elite overproduction, the margin calls of disaster capitalism. His deep dive into psychology allows him to understand the behavioral paralysis of the population.
But his physical reality as a farmer anchors all of this high-level theory in the unavoidable physics of dirt, water, and caloric energy. He understands the theoretical algorithms, but he also knows exactly what it feels like when the frost kills the barley.
Which brings us to the ultimate necessary question.
We have spent an hour inside the mind of an incredibly sophisticated systems analyst who has diagnosed a terminal disease in the architecture of modern society. He knows the political system is a circus. He knows the economic system is a rigged extraction machine. He knows the masses are linguistically programmed to accept it, and he refuses to wait for an AI or an alien to fix it.
So with all of this terrifying clarity, what is Joka's actionable protocol? How does a man with this level of insight operate in the physical world on a Tuesday morning?
Yeah, what does he actually do?
His solution is breathtakingly anticlimactic, yet profoundly radical in its execution. He is not organizing a kinetic assault on the Parliament building. He knows the people inside are just middle managers. He isn't attempting to build a massive, heavily armed compound to fight off the WEF. His response is an act of extreme, localized sovereignty. He states, quite simply, that he is planting pumpkins on the edge of his compost heap.
Let's analyze the structural metaphor of that action. A compost heap is literally a pile of decaying organic matter. It is the rot and the refuse of the old cycle breaking down. By planting his seeds directly into the decay of the old system, he is bypassing the entire abstract architecture of the global market. He is physically manifesting new caloric energy from the breakdown of the past.
He pairs this physical act with a psychological posture. He states he is getting his popcorn ready.
Just sitting back and watching.
This implies a conscious withdrawal of his emotional and cognitive energy from the macro system. He refuses to be a frantic participant in the political circus. He has relegated himself to the role of an observer, watching a failing system inevitably collapse under its own mathematical contradictions.
But his withdrawal is not entirely passive. He explicitly outlines his points of absolute resistance. He declares a hard refusal to participate in the digital leap into a mass-surveilled dystopia. He understands the mechanics of Scenario A, the techno-feudalism, and he simply refuses to integrate his biology into that network.
He draws a hard line.
He will not utilize the smart tech. He will not rely on the digital currency. He will not willingly walk into the algorithmic cage.
And his prescriptive advice to the reader reading his manifesto is remarkably grounded. He doesn't advocate for complex financial hedging or paramilitary training. He advises the individual to take physical control of their immediate baseline survival. He suggests keeping a few extra cans of physical food in the cupboard. He is advocating for a quiet, irreducible, highly individualized defection from the fragile systems of global dependency.
It is a remarkable place to land after the intellectual journey he took us on. He uses Harvard philosophers, geopolitical analysis, and algorithmic forecasting to prove that the architecture of the modern world is fundamentally doomed. And his ultimate conclusion is, the global superstructure is falling apart, but my immediate patch of dirt still requires my attention. He reclaims the absolute smallest, most localized unit of reality over which he has complete sovereign control.
Which brings us to the synthesis of this deep dive. We began by standing in the freezing shadow of the Finnish parliament, observing a tiny fraction of the agricultural baseline begging the political management class for survival.
We dissected the mechanics of how the relentless application of the global free market, the algorithm of neoliberalism, systematically liquidates localized resilience in the pursuit of temporary efficiency.
We brought in the analytical frameworks to explain the how and the why. We used Alfie Kohn to map the destruction of communal networks, Michael Sandel to understand the moral arrogance of the ruling class, Michael Parenti to expose the rigged legal architecture of the market.
Naomi Klein to explain the exploitation of the resulting crises, Peter Turchin to model the destructive math of elite overproduction, and Jean Rawls to prove the fundamental immorality of risking basic survival on a global casino floor.
We projected those mechanics forward to stare into the dystopia of the boiling frog, analyzing the terrifying fragility of the urban concrete jungle and the cynical rebranding of engineered austerity as a moral green transition. We charted the various endgame trajectories, from the sterilized control grids of the WEF to the unpredictable chaos of an AI singularity, ultimately confronting the grueling reality of a slow generational decay.
And finally, we decoded Juka, the anarchist, the programmer, the farmer. A man armed with a forensic understanding of psychological manipulation and systems failure, who stared directly into the abyss of a collapsing civilization and calmly decided to plant a pumpkin seed in the rot.
The utility of Juka's essay does not depend on your alignment with his specific political diagnoses or his timeline for collapse. The value lies in the fundamental question his analysis forces upon you. He forces you to audit the architecture of your own existence.
He is demanding that you ask yourself, to what degree have I outsourced my biological survival, my cognitive autonomy, and my physical security to complex, fragile, global algorithms over which I possess absolutely zero control? When a localized shock hits the system, do I have any physical redundancy, or am I entirely reliant on an invisible hand that might evaporate the moment it becomes unprofitable to feed me?
It is the ultimate question of individual sovereignty. The system is designed to make you feel comfortable while stripping away your capacity to survive outside of it. The water is getting warmer, the algorithms are getting tighter, and the political circus is getting louder to distract you from the crumbling foundation. Juka looked at the board, realized the game was rigged, and decided to stop playing. He chose the physical reality of his compost heap over the abstract promises of the digital matrix. So we leave you with a final, mechanical question to analyze in the context of your own life. You understand the fragility of the macro systems. You see the trajectory of the algorithms.
Yes.
If you were to adopt Juka's framework of radical localized sovereignty, if you decided to stop waiting for an external savior to fix the circus tent, and instead started building a microscopic, resilient system you actually control, what is your version of planting a pumpkin on the edge of the compost heap? What specific, physical, irreducible piece of reality can you secure for yourself today while the rest of the world remains hypnotized in the slowly boiling pot?